Hello, my name is Dr. Simone Henriksen, and I'd like to share with you a paper that I recently published in Regulation and Governance. The paper is entitled Rethinking the National Quality Framework, Improving the Quality and Safety of Alcohol and Other Drug Treatment in Australia. I have an abstract here. So this paper considers the National Quality Framework for Alcohol and Other Drug Treatment Services in Australia. So alcohol and other drug treatment, it's a therapy that's designed to reduce a person's problem use of alcohol or other substances and provide them with a pathway to recovery. Now, several government inquiries in Australia have raised concerns or had raised concerns about the safety and quality of AOD treatment in Australia. Several examples of harm were identified during these inquiries, such as exploitive billing practices, lack of informed consent for clients' financial and treatment decisions, and concerns around safety and effectiveness of treatment. It found that these government inquiries found that governance of the AOD treatment sector was piecemeal and that there's no overarching level of oversight of the sector. So in response to this, on the 28th of November 2019, the Australian Government Department of Health introduced the NQF. The aim of the NQF is to set a nationally consistent quality benchmark for AOD treatment services in Australia. So under the NQF, all specialist AOD treatment providers, both publicly and privately funded providers, are required to meet national accreditation standards for the delivery of services to patients. Now, the NQF is significant because it's the first national mandatory quality framework to be applied across the sector in Australia. Further, it has the potential to provide the overarching regulatory oversight that's currently missing from the sector. So this paper specifically focuses on the monitoring and enforcement strategy of the NQF. And it's an interesting strategy because it distinguishes according to the funding status of a treatment provider. So for publicly funded AOD treatment providers, monitoring and enforcement of the NQF occurs via contractual terms contained in the service agreement between the Commonwealth or state funder and the service provider. However, monitoring and enforcement of the NQF for privately funded providers remains at the discretion of each state and territory in Australia. At the time of writing this paper, there was no arrangements in place to monitor and enforce the NQF in privately funded providers in any state or territory in Australia. So this arrangement raises concerns about the absence of an appropriate regulatory structure to support the NQF. And it finds that the quality and safety of AOD treatment services in Australia can't be guaranteed, particularly in the privately funded group. So in this paper, I find that this proposed strategy really challenges the goal of promoting a nationally consistent approach to the quality and safety of AOD treatment in Australia. Firstly, I start in the paper by considering the use of existing contractual arrangements to monitor and enforce the NQF. Now, these service agreements, these public-private partnerships, they're important. They're a dominant form of regulation that's used to influence the delivery of AOD treatment services in Australia. The delivery of publicly funded AOD treatment services is based on contract, it's regulated by contract, and it's through these contracts or service agreements that treatment providers, publicly funded treatment providers, are required to be accredited against the NQF. Now, this can be cost effective because it's relying on existing regulatory structures. However, at the same time, linking the NQF to funding eligibility is limited in its capacity to regulate. Now, it may be a sound regulatory approach to ensuring all publicly funded AOD treatment providers hold accreditation at the point of entry, but setting minimum requirements is only one part of a system of regulation. Typically, a system of regulation would also have a body or agency responsible for monitoring compliance coupled with an enforcement strategy. So a key challenge with this approach is that the complexity of public funding for AOD treatment services makes ongoing monitoring of the NQF via contractual arrangements very, very difficult. Funding flows are an issue. There can often be separation between the funding source and the ultimate service provider, making it difficult for the original funder to effectively monitor compliance with the National Quality Framework, and that can have similar implications for enforcement of the NQF by the original funder. We know that contract law can be used to promote deterrence and secure compliance in certain situations. For example, with the NQF, a contract may be terminated for non-compliance. There may be dispute resolution mechanisms that may be incorporated into a contract to help secure compliance. But one of the key challenges of using contract law in this situation is the absence of a credible range of sanctions. In Australia, access to publicly funded AED treatment services can be quite difficult. Many patients experience long wait times, and privately funded treatment is very expensive. So where there's only one sanction available or limited sanctions available, and the effect of those is to further restrict access to treatment, a regulator may be reluctant to use it. And that may ultimately undermine the purpose of the National Quality Framework. Indeed, this was a situation in the aged care sector in Australia, where the aged care regulator had the power to revoke an aged care provider's accreditation for non-compliance, but they rarely used it because they had a lack of flexible enforcement tools and powers. And this was ultimately found to contribute to substandard care in 1 in 3 patients in the aged care sector in Australia. One of the most significant limitations of using contractual arrangements as a monitoring and enforcement strategy is their scope of application. So this mechanism, as I've mentioned, will only apply to publicly funded specialist providers. It's important that all AED treatment providers are, regardless of their funding status, are properly regulated. However, not all specialist AED treatment providers are publicly funded. So this means contractual mechanisms will have no application in the privately funded group. So each state and territory has the discretion on how to decide to monitor and enforce the NQF for privately funded specialist providers. Now, this discretion arises under the Australian Constitution. But in the absence of a statutory framework for the NQF, the regulation of privately funded specialist AED treatment providers will remain largely a self-regulated model. And whilst at the same time, publicly funded providers have to reach a higher bar before providing treatment services. So there's a very real risk of patients being exposed to poor quality and inappropriate treatment, AED treatment in Australia. One of the key challenges with giving or having each state and territory this prerogative to choose how to monitor and enforce the National Quality Framework in the privately funded group is consistency in the choice of regulatory tool. Now, this is important to discourage providers from shifting to a more favourable regulatory environment. Also, another limitation is that using 2 different mechanisms for monitoring and enforcing the NQF, there can be substantive differences that might arise within a jurisdiction due to this distinction. And this may undermine the trust and legitimacy of the regulatory process. The current design also limits the opportunity for regulatory cooperation between jurisdictions. We do have a national directory that's going to be developed, but that'll be a very good tool for consumers. But beyond that, for consumers to identify who's accredited and who isn't. But beyond that tool, there's no provision in the proposed regulatory framework for information sharing between regulators in different jurisdictions or within a jurisdiction itself, between regulators responsible for privately funded and publicly funded providers. So that's a serious gap in the regulatory framework. So to overcome the regulatory challenges, in the paper I explore whether facility licensing may be a more appropriate tool for monitoring and enforcing the NQF. Facility licensure is a feature of health regulation in Australia. All states and territories have enacted statutory licensing frameworks for private health facilities. We know that licensing is quite good for controlling entry into and out of a particular market by setting minimum standards. And it can also, licensing will be useful here because it can address that limited scope of that occurs with the contractual arrangements. Licensing can also operate as a public safety mechanism by incentivising desired behaviour. Research shows that patients seeking AOD treatment services in Australia are at risk of harm. So we can use that licensing to address these harms by incentivising compliance with the National Quality Framework and therefore promoting appropriate behaviour. One of the key advantages of a licensing scheme is that they typically invoke a regulatory enforcement pyramid, and that's consistent with the concept of continuous quality improvement. And it addresses that key challenge that is present under the using contract law. Also, one of the other shortcomings of having accreditation as a standalone method of regulation is that typically accrediting bodies lack the power to apply formal sanctions. Licensing can also alter behaviour very quickly. We know historically that patients in accessing AOD treatment in Australia are exposed to harm. Even as recently, that we know this harm is continuing as recently as 2020, an inquiry into a facility in Western Australia showed that patients were still being exposed to harm even after the National Quality Framework had come into effect. Finally, licensing would negate that need to have two different regulatory tools. It can apply across the sector more broadly, where there doesn't need to be that distinguishing between funding status. Licensing could also facilitate that information sharing between jurisdictions through mutual recognition of orders or decisions regarding non-compliance with the National Quality Framework. There are some disadvantages to licensing, such as cost and the ability of licensing to improve the quality and safety of treatment, and that's largely dependent upon the quality of the assessment process for accreditation. And there also needs to be a will on the behalf of state agencies to implement a licensing scheme. So in this paper, I also explore how a statutory licensing scheme may be enacted by looking at two options. The first option is enacting uniform legislation and amending existing state and territory health. The second option is amending existing territory health and facility licensing statutes. So I discuss the complexities that arise in uniform legislation. For example, it can be a very lengthy process. It requires consensus from all jurisdictions, and it doesn't always result in identical laws being enacted in every state and territory. Similarly, amending existing state and territory legislation can also result in differences between jurisdictions. However, it may overcome any unnecessary duplication of existing regulation. A final limitation, though, associated with the National Quality Framework is this risk of regulatory capture. Now, this risk arises regardless of whether contract or licensing is the regulatory tool of choice. And regulatory capture, it arises due to the use of accreditation in a sector where we have a very high demand for treatment. So to overcome this, there needs to be a clear distinction in this accreditation process between what's accepted industry practice and evidence-based practice. So I hope this gives you an overview of my paper, and I hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you.